The Long Ships. Part 1. The Long Voyage. Chapter 3. How they sailed southwards, and how they found themselves a good guide. Croc's men were hungry, very hungry, when they reached Weather Island, for they had had to row the whole way there. They lay to and went ashore to gather fuel and cook themselves a good dinner. They found there only a few old fishermen, who on account of their poverty were not afraid of plunderers. When they came to cut up the sheep, they praised their fatness and the evident excellence of the spring pasturing on the mound. They stuck the joints on their spears and held them in the fire, and their mouths watered as the fat began to crackle, for it was a long time since their nostrils had known such a cheering smell. Many of them exchanged stories of the last occasions on which they had been so present at so tasty a meal, and they all agreed that their voyage to the lands of the West had begun promisingly. Then they began to eat, so that the juice of the meat ran over their beards. By this time, Orm had regained his senses, but he was still sick and dizzy, and when he came ashore with the others, it was all he could do to keep on his legs. He sat down and held his head between his hands and made no reply to the words that were addressed to him. But after a while, when he had vomited and drunk water, he felt better, and when he smelt the odor of the frying meat, he raised his head like a man who has just waked up and looked at the men around him. The man who was sitting nearest to him grinned in a friendly way and cut off a bit of his meat and offered it to him. "Take this and eat it," he said. "You never tasted better in your life." "I know its quality," replied Orm. "I provided it." He took the meat and held it between his fingers without eating it. He looked thoughtfully around the circle, at each man in turn, and then said, "Where is the man I hit? Is he dead?" "He is dead," replied his neighbor, "but no one here stands to avenge him, and you are to row in his stead. His oar lies in front of mine, so it will be well that you and I should be friends. My name is Toka. What is yours?" Orm told him his name and asked him, "The man I killed, was he a good fighter?" "He was, as you observed, somewhat slow of movement," replied Toka, "and he was not so handy with a sword as I am myself, but that would be asking a lot of a man, for I am one of the finest swordsmen in our company. Still, he was a strong man and steadfast, and of good name. He was called Ala, and his father sows 12 bushels of rye, and he had been to sea twice already. If you can row as well as he did, you had no mean oarsman." When Orm heard this, it seemed to cheer his spirits, and he began to eat. But after a few minutes he asked, "Who was it who struck me down?" Croc was sitting a short way from him, and heard his question. He laughed and raised his axe, finished his mouthful, and said, "This is the maid who kissed you. Had she bitten you, you would not have asked her name." Orm gazed at Croc with rounded eyes that looked as though they had never blinked, and then said with a sigh, "I had no helmet, and was breathless from running. Otherwise it might have gone differently." "You are a conceited puppy, Scanian," said Croc, "and fancy yourself a soldier. But you are yet young, and lack a soldier's prudence. For prudent men do not forget their helmets when they run out after sheep, nay, not even when their own wives are stolen from them. But you seem to be a man whom fortune smiles on, and it may be that you will bring us all into her good favor. We have seen already 3 manifestations of her love for you. Firstly, you slipped on the rocks as 2 spears were flying towards you. Then Ola, whom you slew, has no kinsman or close comrade among us who is bound to avenge him. And thirdly, I did not kill you, because I wish to have an oarsman to replace him. Therefore I believe you to be a man of great good luck, who can thereby be of use to us. Wherefore I now give you the freedom of our company, provided only that you agree to take Ola's oar." They all thought that Croc had spoken well. Orm munched his meat reflectively. Then he said, "I accept the freedom you offer me, nor do I think I need feel ashamed to do so, though you stole my sheep. But I will not row as a slave, for I am of noble blood, and though I am young, yet I hold myself to be a good soldier, for I slew Orla, and he was one. I therefore claim back my sword. This provoked a long and complicated discussion. Some of them regarded Orm's demand as altogether unreasonable, and said that he ought to think himself lucky to have been granted his life, but others remarked that self-esteem was no great fault in a young man, and that the claims of those whom fortune smiled on should not be lightly ignored. Toke laughed and said that he was amazed that so many men, 3 full ship's companies, could be anxious about whether or not one boy was to be allowed to carry a sword. A man called Calf, who had spoken against granting Orm's request, wanted to fight Toke for saying this, and Toke said that he would be glad to oblige him just as soon as he had finished the good kidney that he was just then occupied with. But Croc forbade them to fight over such a matter. The end of it all was that Orm got his sword back, but that his future behavior would determine whether he was to be treated as a slave or as a comrade. But Orm was to pay Croc for his sword, which was a fine weapon, as soon as he won anything on the voyage. By this time a light breeze had sprung up, and Croc said that it was time for them to avail themselves of it, and set sail. So they all went aboard, and the ship made its way up through the Kattegat, with its sails filled with the wind. Orm stared back across the sea, and said that it was lucky for Croc that they had few ships left at home in these parts at this time of year, for if he knew his mother, she would else by now have been on their tails, with half the people of the mound assisting her. Then he washed the wound in his head, and rinsed the clotted blood from his hair, and Croc said that the scar on his forehead would be a fine thing to show womenfolk. Then Toke produced an old leather helmet with iron bands. He said it was not much of a helmet for these times, but that he had found it among the Wends, and that he had nothing better that he could spare. It would, he said, be of not much use against an axe, but still it would be better than nothing. Orm tried it on, and found that it would fit him when the swelling had gone down. Orm thanked Toke, and they both knew now that they would be good friends. They rounded the Skaw with a good following wind, and there, after ancient custom, they sacrificed to Aegir and all his kin, offering sheep's flesh and pork and ale, and were followed for a long while afterwards by shrieking gulls, which they took to be a good omen. They rowed down the Jutland coast, where the country was deserted, and the ribs of wrecked ships were often to be seen in the sand. Farther south they went ashore on 2 small islands, where they found water and food, but little else. They proceeded down the coast, for the most part with favourable winds helping them, so that the men became good-humoured through being relieved of the tiresome labour of constant rowing. Toke said that Orm was perhaps weather-lucky, as well as being ordinarily fortunate, and that weather luck was one of the best kinds of luck that a man could have, so that if this were in fact so, Orm could indeed hope for a prosperous future. Orm thought that Toke might be right, but Croc was unwilling to agree with them on this point. "It is I who bring us this good weather," he said, "for we have had good weather and winds from the very beginning, long before Orm joined us. Indeed, if I had not known my weather luck to be reliable, I should not have ventured on this expedition. But Orm's luck is good, if not of the same quality as my own, and the more lucky men we have aboard, the better it will be for us all." Bersa the Wise agreed, and said that men without luck had the hardest burden of all to bear. "For man can triumph over man, and weapon over weapon. Against the gods we can pit sacrifice, and against witchcraft, contrary magic. But against bad luck, no man has anything to oppose." Toke said that for his part, he did not know whether he had great good luck, except that his luck in fishing had always been good. He had always done well enough against men with whom he had quarrelled, but that might be the result of his strength and skill, rather than of his luck. "But what worries me," he said, "is whether on this expedition we shall have gold luck and woman luck, for I have heard great tales of all the fine things that are to be found here in the West, and it is beginning to seem a long time since I felt a gold ring, or a woman. Even if we only find silver instead of gold, and no princesses, such as Bersa has spoken of, but simply Frankish housewives, I shall not complain. I'm not a fussy man." Croc said that Toke would have to be patient for a little longer, however strong his desire for either commodity, and Toke agreed that it certainly seemed likely that he would have to wait for a while, for it did not look as though either gold or women grew on trees in these parts. They sailed along flat coasts, where nothing was to be seen except sand and marshlands and an occasional fishing hut. Then they passed promontories on which tall crosses stood, and knew that they had come to the Christians' land, and to the Frankish coasts. For the wise men among them knew that these crosses had first been set up by the great Emperor Charles, the father of all emperors, to keep Nordic seafarers away from his land. But the gods of the north had proved stronger than his. They put into creeks to take refuge from threatening squalls and to rest overnight, and saw waters more salt and green than any they had seen before, rising and falling with the ebb and flood tides. There were no ships to be seen, and no people, only here and there the traces of some old building. Many villages had flourished in these parts before the first Northmen came, but everything had long since been plundered and laid waste, so that nowadays men had to travel far to the south before they could find any prizes worth the taking. They came down to where the sea narrowed between England and the mainland, and there was talk among them of turning towards the English coast, for they knew that King Edgar had recently died, and that he had been succeeded by sons who were not yet of age, which had made the land much sought after by the Vikings. But Krok and Bersa and the others among the wisest of them held that the country of the Franks was still the best, if one went far enough south, for the King of Frankland and the Emperor of Germany were at war with each other on a point of dispute concerning their frontiers, and the coastal regions of countries at war always provided good hunting grounds for the Northmen. So they continued down the Frankish coast, but here they lay farther out to sea, and kept a sharp lookout on every quarter, for they had now come to that region which certain Northmen had won from the king of the Franks. Here ancient crosses were constantly to be seen on promontories and at river mouths, but even more frequent were pikes, with bearded heads set on them, to signify that the rulers of that land had no desire to welcome seamen from their own northern climes upon their coasts. Krok and his men thought that this showed scant hospitality on the part of the men who were now enjoying the fruits of the land, but they said it was only what was to be expected of men from Scania and Seeland, and they asked Orm whether he had any kinsmen in these parts. Orm replied that he had none, as far as he knew, since his kinsmen always sailed to Ireland, but that he would bear in mind when he got home this idea of putting heads on poles, for they would make fine scarecrows to protect his sheep. They all laughed at this, and thought that he was well able to speak up for himself. They hid in ambush at the mouth of a river, and took some fishing boats, but they found little of worth in them, and could elicit no reply from the men in the boats when they asked where the rich villages were around here. When they had killed a couple of them, and could still get no intelligible answer from the others, they let them go alive, since they were of miserable appearance, and would be of no use as rowers, and would fetch no price as slaves. More than once they slipped ashore under the cover of night, but they won little, for the people lived in large and well-guarded villages, and several times they had to make haste back to their ships to avoid being surrounded and outnumbered. They hoped that they would soon come to the end of the region where the Northmen held sway. One evening they met 4 longships rowing from the south. They looked to be heavily laden, and Krok let his ships move near to them, so that he might see how strongly they were manned. It was a calm evening, and they rowed slowly towards each other. The strangers set a long shield upon their mast top, with its point turned upwards, as a sign that they came as friends, and Krok's men conversed with them at the distance of a spear's throw, while each chieftain tried to calculate the other's strength. The strangers said that they were from Jutland, and that they were on their way home after a long voyage. They had plundered in Brittany with 7 ships during the previous summer, and had then ventured far to the south. Afterwards they had wintered on an island off the mouth of the Loire, and had ventured up the river, but then a cruel plague had broken out among them, and now they were making their way home with such ships as had strength to man. When asked what they had won, they replied that a wise seaman never counts his wealth until he has brought it safely home, but this they could tell him, since at this meeting they reckoned themselves strong enough to hold what they had won, that they had no complaint to make about the amount of their catch. There was always the possibility of a bad season compared with the ways things had been in the old days, and that held true however far southward one might travel. But anyone who happened on a part of Brittany that had hitherto escaped plunder would be able to find good reward for his pains. Croc asked whether they had any wine or good ale that they would be willing to exchange for pork or dried fish. Meanwhile, he tried to come nearer their ships, for he was sorely tempted to hazard an attack on them, and by this means get a fine return for his whole voyage at one swoop. But the Jutish captain at once brought his ship round to bar their path, with his prow facing them, and replied that he preferred to keep his wine and ale for his own use. "But by all means come nearer," he said to Croc, "if there is anything else you care to sample." Croc weighed a spear in his hand, and seemed uncertain which course to take. But at that moment a commotion broke out on one of the Jutish ships. 2 men could be seen struggling with each other by the gunwale. Then they fell into the water, still locked in each other's arms. Both of them sank, and one was seen no more. But the other rose to the surface at a distance from the ship, only to dive again when a spear was thrown at him by one of the men he had left. There was much shouting on the Jutish ship, but when Croc's men asked them what was the matter, they received no reply. Dusk was now beginning to descend, and after a brief exchange of words, the strangers began to row forward again, before Croc could decide whether or not to join battle. Then Toka, who sat at his larboard oar, just behind Orm, on Croc's own ship, cried to Croc, "Come and look at this! My fishing luck gets better all the time!" One hand was gripping Toka's oar, and one Orm's, and a face lay in the water between the hands, staring up at the ship. It was big-eyed and very pale, black-haired and black-bearded. "This is a bold fellow and a good swimmer," said one of the men. "He has dived under our ship to get away from the Jutes." "And a wise man, too," said the other, "for he sees that we are better men than they." A third said, "He's black like a troll and yellow like a corpse, and does not look like the sort of man who brings good luck with him. It is dangerous to take such a man aboard." They discussed the advantages and disadvantages of doing so, and some of them shouted questions at the man in the water, but he lay there without moving, clinging tightly to the oars and blinking his eyes and swaying with the sea. At last Croc ordered him to be brought aboard. He could always be killed later, he explained to those who opposed the idea, if the course of things showed that it would be the best thing to do. So Toka and Orma drew in their oars and hauled the man aboard. He was yellow-skinned and strongly built, and naked to the waist, with only a few rags to cover him. He tottered on his feet, and could hardly stand, but he clenched his fist and shook it at the Jutish ships as they merged into the distance, spitting after them and grinding his teeth. Then he cried something and fell headlong as the ship rolled, but was quickly on his feet again, and beat his breast, and stretched his arms towards the sky, and cried in a different voice, but in words that none of them could understand. When Orm was old, and told of all the things that had befallen him, he used to say that he had never heard so terrible a grinding of teeth, nor so pitiful and ringing a voice as when this stranger cried out to the sky. They all wondered at him and questioned him profusely as to who he was and what had happened to him. He understood some of what they said and was able to reply brokenly in the Nordic tongue, and they thought he said that he was a Jute, and that he disliked rowing on Saturdays, and that it was for this reason that he hated the men he had now escaped from. But this made no sense to them, and some of them were of the opinion that he was crazy. They gave him food and drink, and he ate greedily of beans and fish, but when they offered him salt pork, he rejected it with disgust. Croc said that he would do to man and oar, and that when the voyage was over, they could sell him for a good sum. Meanwhile, Bersa, out of his wisdom, could try to make something of what this stranger said, and discover whether he had any useful information to give them about the lands from which he had come. So, during the next few days, Bersa sat and talked a good deal with the stranger, and they conversed as well as they could. Bersa was a calm and patient man, a great eater and a skilful bard, who had gone to sea to get away from a shrewish wife. He was wise and full of cunning, and bit by bit he succeeded in piecing together most of what the stranger had to say. This he told to Croc and the others. "He is not crazy," said Bersa, "though he seems so. Nor is he a Jute, although we thought him to be one. He says that he is a Jew. They are a people from the East who killed the man whom the Christians regard as their god. This killing took place a long time ago, but the Christians still cherish a great hatred against these Jews because of it, and like to kill them, and will not accept any ransom for them or show them any clemency. For this reason, most of the Jews live in lands ruled by the Caliph of Cordoba, since in his kingdom, the man they killed it is not regarded as a god." Bersa added that he had heard some talk of this before, and many others said that they too had heard rumors relating to it. Orm said that he had heard that the dead man had been nailed to a tree, as the sons of Ragnar Harrybreeks had done in the old days with the chief priest of England. But how they could continue to regard him as a god after these Jews had killed him, none of them could understand, for obviously no true god could be killed by man. Then Bersa went on to tell them more of what he had managed to grasp of the Jews' story. "He has been a slave of the Jutes for a year, and there he underwent much suffering, because he would not row on Saturdays, for the god of the Jews gets very angry with a Jew who does anything on that day. But the Jutes could not understand this, though he often tried to explain it to them, and they beat and starved him when he refused to row. It was while he was in their hands that he learned the little he knows of our tongue. But when he speaks of them, he curses them in his own language, because he does not know sufficient words in ours to do so. He says that he wept much when he was among them, and cried to his God for help. Then when he saw our ship approaching, he knew that his cry had been heard. When he jumped overboard, he dragged with him a man who had often beaten him. He asked his God to be a shield to him, and not to let the other man escape. That, he says, is why no spear hit him, and how he found the strength to dive under our ship. And so powerful is the name of his God that he will not name him to me, however much I try to persuade him to do so. That is what he says of the Jutes and his escape from them. And he has more to tell us about something else, which he thinks we shall find useful. But much of what he says about this I cannot clearly understand." They were all curious to know what else the Jew had to say, which might be useful to them, and at last Bersa managed to discover the gist of it. "He says," Bersa told them, "that he is a wealthy man in his own country, which lies within the Caliph of Cordoba's kingdom. His name is Solomon, and he is a silversmith, besides apparently being a great poet. He was captured by a Christian chieftain who came from the north and plundered the region where he lives. This chieftain made him send for a large sum of money to ransom himself, and then sold him to a slave trader, for the Christians do not like to keep their word to the Jews because they killed their god. The slave trader sold him at sea to merchants, from whom he was captured by the Jutes, and it was his bad fortune to be set at once to pull an oar on a Saturday. Now he hates these Jutes with a bitter hatred, but even that is mild compared with the hatred he feels towards the Christian chieftain who betrayed him. This chieftain is very rich, and lives only a day's march from the sea, and he says that he will gladly show us how to get there, so that we may plunder the chieftain of all he possesses, and burn down his house, and take out his eyes, and loose him naked among the stones and trees. He says that there is wealth for us all there." They all agreed that this was the best news that they had heard for many a day, and Solomon, who had been sitting beside Bersa while he was recounting all this, and had been following him as well as he could, leapt to his feet with a great cry and a joyful countenance, and cast himself full length on the deck before Croc, and put a tuft of his beard into his mouth, and chewed it. Then he seized one of Croc's feet, and placed it upon his neck, all the while babbling like a drunken man in words that no one could understand. When he had calmed himself a little, he began to search among the words of their language that he knew. He said that he wished to serve Croc and his men faithfully until they had won these riches and he had gained his revenge. But he asked for a definite promise that he himself should be allowed to pluck out the eyes of the Christian chieftain. Both Croc and Bearse agreed that this was a reasonable request. On each of the 3 ships, the men now began hotly to discuss all this, and it put them in the best of spirits. They said that the stranger might not bring much luck to himself, to judge by what had happened to him, but that he might bring all the more to them, and Toka thought that he had never hooked a better fish. They treated the Jew as a friend, and collected a few clothes for him to wear, and gave him ale to drink, though they had not much left. The country to which he wished to guide them was called Leon, and they knew roughly where it lay. On their right hand, between the land of the Franks and that of the Cordovan Caliph, perhaps 5 good days' sailing southward from the Breton Cape, which they could now see. They sacrificed again to the sea people, were rewarded with a good wind, and sailed on into the open sea.